What's going on, guys? It's Cooper Codes, and in this video we are going to create this full GitHub login system. This system allows you to authenticate users with GitHub and also allows you to make calls to the GitHub API, such as managing the repos and stuff like that. For this video, we're going to have a simple login with GitHub. It will redirect you to a GitHub login screen that will authenticate you for a certain OAuth application that we're going to create through GitHub. So you can press authorize here. Then we're going to see that we get access to a token from the user that allows us to make actions on the user's behalf. For example, we can get data of a certain user. For example, I'm on the Cooper Codes account right now, and I can even go to the link to my profile and see my profile picture from GitHub alongside a bunch of other data. So let's say you're like a social media application and you want to do a GitHub integration. You could show a link to the profile on someone's social media page, for example, and it would go to a link like this. And as you guys will see, it will link to my GitHub here. Let's get started by looking at a diagram of the system we are going to create in this video. In this video, we are going to create a system which consists of the React frontend, a proxy server using Express that's going to then interact with the GitHub API. Proxy servers can be confusing. One of the main reasons why we use a proxy server or an external server to manage our GitHub API requests is because the GitHub API uses a client secret. We do not want our client secret to be exposed on the front end. And so if our front end makes a call to the proxy server, for example, and then the proxy server uses the client secret, our front end never sees that client secret, for example. But it's also important to understand that our React project is going to hold our client ID. You can kind of think about the client ID as a username and the client secret as a password. So the client ID is non-sensitive and it identifies our specific GitHub OAuth project. Let's look at the path of how data flows when we authenticate a user. So when the user logs in, we want to get access to a token for a certain user. On our front end, we are going to get something called a code from that GitHub login screen. With that code, we can then get an access token. From our proxy server, we are then going to ask the GitHub API for a certain user's access token, passing the client secret to the call. That's why that's important there, is it keeps everything secretive from the front end so they can't see our client secret. GitHub's going to have something like /authenticate_user, for example, and this /authenticate_user route is going to send data back to the proxy server, which is then going to send that access token which we want. Our proxy server is then going to finally send that access token to our React frontend, and then we can do things with the GitHub API. In this video, we're only going to do a simple get the data for a certain user, but we still get access to that access token, which allows us to make calls to the GitHub API on the user's behalf. Hopefully this explanation was helpful in understanding this system. Now let's get building. We can get started by initializing everything we need from the GitHub side of things. So go to github.com and then log in with whatever account you want to own the OAuth application. We can create an OAuth application by clicking here in the top right and going to settings, scrolling all the way down from settings and go to developer settings on the left here. Inside of developer settings, we are going to then go to OAuth apps. Inside of here, we can register a new application. We can name the application. I'm just going to call it login with GitHub. For the homepage URL, I'm going to put in localhost 3000. This is where our React application is going to be hosted on. And then for the callback URL, I'm also going to use localhost 3000. There's a 3-step process to understand is that we press the login button and then we are going to go to the GitHub login page. From the GitHub login page, when the user gets logged in successfully, it's going to send them to whatever this link right here is. So if you want to do something else, for example, localhost 3000/success, you can totally do that for this callback URL, but for this video, I'm just going to send them back to localhost 3000. For this video, I'm not going to be working with device flow, so I'm not going to enable that, and we can register our application. So you should be at a page that looks like this. This means that we are good to go with the GitHub stuff. When we need the client ID and client secret, I'm going to run back over to this page then. So make sure you keep this in the background. Let's get started by creating our React application. Let's get started by opening up an empty folder and then going to the terminal and creating our React application by saying npx create-react-app and then the name of our application, which I'm just going to call client. We can go to the client folder by saying cd client. So now we're in that React folder that we just created. I'm going to do a somewhat controversial thing for this video, but I'm going to provide an explanation as to why. Go to the source folder and then go to index.js. Just to make this tutorial more simple, I'm going to remove react.strict mode. One thing that happens with React strict mode is that it re-renders our application twice. So why could this be an issue? Well, the GitHub OAuth gives us a code which can only be used once. So here's what happens is we get the one-time code, and then on the first render, we use the one-time code and we get an access token, which is what we'd expect, right? On the second render, we use the one-time code again, the same exact code, and we get an error from our server saying that that code has already been used to try and get an access token. There are ways where you can pretty much do like an if else and try and get out of these errors, but to make this tutorial nice and clean, I'm just going to get rid of the React strict mode by removing it here. It's important to also understand that React strict mode does not run in production. It is something used specifically for development environments. And so if we're developing and we are finding that it's causing us a lot of issues, then we can make a kind of educated decision as to if we want that React strict mode to continue in our application. So make sure that your root.render just has the app inside of it, and then we can head over to app.js. So now we can get started by creating the initial logic for logging in a user. So let me explain in detail what's happening during the user login. To log in a user with GitHub OAuth, we are going to forward the user to the GitHub login screen, and GitHub knows it's for our specific client because when we forward the user, we pass in the client ID, so that's how they know it's us. User is now on the GitHub side and logs in. So they're on like, github.com/login, whatever that might be. And so when user decides to log in, they get forwarded back to localhost 3000 because that's the link we told GitHub to redirect us back to. There's a very important thing here. Localhost 3000 is going to have a variable attached to it that's going to look something like this. Code is equal to, whatever the code's equal to from GitHub side. And so when this code exists in our link, that is when we know that a user has logged in because the only way we get that code is if GitHub redirects to localhost 3000 with this code attached to it. And then we can use the code to get the access token. It only allows us to get the access token and the code can only be used once. It's really important that I fully explain this because as I do the forwarding and stuff like that, I want to make sure that everyone's on the same page. So let's go back to our GitHub application here and grab this client ID. I'm going to save the client ID at the top of our application by saying const client_ID is equal to this. And so a super easy way to forward a user, we can kind of put the forwarding logic in one function. I'm going to say login with GitHub is to say window.location.assign. This navigates to the given URL as Visual Studio is telling us here. And so we can then pass in a URL for the window to go to. This is a URL that's defined by GitHub and it's going to be https github.com/login/OAuth/authorize. And then we can add in a parameter to the end of this by saying $client_ID is equal to, and then we can add that client ID const on the end. And that's all we need to forward the user, which is pretty nice. GitHub handles all the logic for us pretty much. So let's go to this returned code and get rid of everything except the header and that div. I'm just going to keep the header here because it gives us some nice styling. And we can make a button which is going to trigger this login with GitHub right here. So we can say button login with GitHub. And if we want to call that React function, we can say onClick login with GitHub. So when the user presses this button, it's going to then assign their location to this login link. So let's npm start our application and see what's going on. Amazing, so we get access to this login with GitHub button. If we press it, we're then going to be forwarded over here. I can authorize my account by pressing this. And you'll see when we get sent back, I'm being sent back to localhost 3000 with a code parameter at the end of it. So we can make some basic code to kind of see if this code parameter exists when our React application gets loaded. So let's go do that. We can go to the top of our application and we can import useEffect from React. One of the things useEffect allows us to do is it allows us to run code once at the beginning of our application. So we can define the useEffect hook by saying useEffect, passing in the parameter for the useEffect, which is going to be nothing, and then defining the callback function by using an arrow, and then braces for the logic of the function. Then at the end of the logic, we can pass in a second parameter to useEffect. That's why we have the comma there, and we are going to pass in an empty array. We use an empty array here because we pretty much only want the useEffect to run once, is a simple way of thinking about it. And so if we want to see if this code exists, kind of like here, so I'm just going to bring this comment down right here because this is kind of what we're looking at is this. We can get the string of our query by saying const query string is equal to window.location.search. So what's kind of in that search bar. We can then get the URL parameter. So for example, code like this by saying const URL params is equal to new URL search params. And we can pass in the query string here. And so we actually get access to extra logic from URL search params to make that whole process of grabbing those variables way easier. So if we want to get the code parameter, we can say const code param is equal to URL params.get, and we can say code. We can console.log the code param here in order to see if we're actually getting this parameter out of our URL. So let's go back to our localhost. So we still have that same code from before, and if we refresh our page, you'll see that it's being logged in our console right here, which is great news. That means we can go and use this code to communicate with the GitHub API. Although this is where we are going to create our proxy server. So we can use this code to get the access token, and as I described in that initial diagram, we are going to make a call to our proxy server, which is then going to call the GitHub API. So let's get started with developing our proxy server. I'm going to create a split terminal. So the terminal on the right is going to be for our server, and make sure that this new terminal you create, or you can use the same one if you want, is outside of that client folder. So we want to be on the outside right here. And we can start by adding in a file called server.js. And then in our terminal, we can say npm init yes. This is going to initialize a package.json for our server to use. We are going to need a couple of packages for our server, so we can start by saying npm install. The first package is going to be body-parser. This allows us to parse data from the front end as it goes to the back end. We are then going to need cores, which is going to allow us to enable cores for our Express server so it can get requests from any origin, so anyone can request our server. I'm also going to install Express, which is that library that allows us to make an Express web server with JavaScript, and also node-fetch, so we can use fetch on our Express server. So your package.json should look something like this, just so you can see that. And so let's go and do server.js, and we can start by making two consts. The first const is going to be our client_ID, which we can either grab from our front end, or we can go back to the GitHub, so I'm just going to do that. So we can get the client ID by going here, so copy your client ID, bring it over to the server.js. And we're also going to make a const for the client secret because we are going to be using it when we call the GitHub API directly. So go over here and press generate a new client secret. It even warns you, make sure to copy the secret now. You won't be able to see it again, but you can always generate a new one if you mess up. But copy this right here, bring it over here. And so now we have the client ID and the client secret, which is great news. So now we can get started by defining all the different libraries that we're going to need for our Express server to work. We can first say var express is equal to require express. This allows us to use the Express web server. We can also say var cores is equal to require cores. Rarely do I ever say this in a tutorial, but the logic for grabbing fetch when you don't have access to import and you want to use require statements instead is very strange. So just copy this for now. Const fetch is equal to ... args. So you're using spread operator on the arguments here, and then you're going to pretty much import node-fetch, and you can use a then here, which again, I wouldn't worry about understanding this logic. It's not really helpful to understand, and all we need is fetch working at the end of the day. Then you're going to go point to an arrow, which is going to call fetch with ... args. We have to do this weird logic because inside of our server.js, we're not using imports, we're using require statements, and so that's why this strange logic has to be introduced. But I would say don't stress about understanding this. Then we're also going to import the body parser by saying var body parser is equal to require body -parser. There we go. We got all these require statements out of the way. So now we can start with actually getting coding. We can define our Express server by saying var app is equal to express. And then we can tell our Express server to use certain middlewares, for example, by using app.use. We can then tell our Express server to kind of use different ways to handle data. For example, app.use cores is a great example. This allows requests to come from any origin, and also app.use bodyparser.json. This allows us to send data to our Express routes in a JSON format. And then we can start our server by saying app.listen on port 4000. And we can do a little function logic here to call once this app.listen is successfully ran. And we can say console.log CORS server running on port 4000. And so we can even npm start this just to see that everything's working at this point. Boom, CORS server running on port 4000. So that is great news. That means we have a server actually running locally that we can start to add more functionality to. So we can start by initializing a GET request, which allows us to get an access token when you have a user's code, for example. So this thing is going to require that there is some type of code being passed from the front end. And so we can make a GET request be defined in Express by saying app.get. Then the route we want to use, I'm going to say /get access token. I'm going to make this an asynchronous function because we're using fetch in the backend here, which is going to use the await statement. We get access to the request and the response from Express. So now here's where the actual authentication happens in our backend. We are going to have some type of code that's coming from our request, which is going to exist in the request.query object, and I'm going to pass it in through the .code. So this app.get isn't going to work unless we have that code defined here. We can now define a fetch statement that's going to access GitHub directly. We can say await fetch, and then the GitHub link for getting an access token from a certain user's code, which you can say is https://github.com/login/OAuth/access_token. This fetch statement is going to require a bunch of parameters on top of this URL. I'm going to define parameters as a variable just so this fetch statement right here isn't like 100 characters long. So we can say is equal to the question mark, which means we are going to start entering URL parameters, and then we can say each parameter which the GitHub API requests us to have. The first one is the client_ID, which we can set equal to the client ID const we made above right here, just so you guys know where it's coming from. Plus, and then and, which means we're going to define another variable. Next one's going to be client_secret, is then going to be equal to client_secret like this. And finally, we are going to need to give the code as well to this request, which we can say is and code is equal to the request.query.code, which is something that our front end is giving to the request when we access the get access token here. I'm also going to console.log the request.query.code here so you guys can see the data kind of moving through our Express backend. So we can add the parameters to the end of the string by saying plus params, and then we can define the logic of the certain fetch request. For example, we want it to be a post request to the GitHub backend. And we also want the headers to be of type accept application/JSON. This allows us to get the access token back in a JSON format. And so to process this JSON format when the fetch request is fully done, we can say .then, take the response from the server, so the GitHub server now, and then say return response.json, which turns it into a JSON that our JavaScript can actually manipulate. So we can say .then data, and this data here is just going to be the return statement of whatever is being passed in the previous .then. And to give the JSON data back to our front end, we can say res.json data, because this res is what defines the response of our Express web server. So the response is defined right here. And so this is actually the full get access token logic. If we also want to see this data in the console, we can say console.log data right here. This is just going to be nice because we can see everything in this console right here for, what's happening in the backend. While we're in the backend, I'm just going to fully define our proxy server by creating the second get request which we're going to need, which is going to be the get user data. For get user data, the access token is going to be passed in as an authorization header. And so that's how we're able to access the access token from our backend. So let's define the query here by saying app.get/getUserData. Again, asynchronous because we are going to be calling the GitHub API here. I'm going to get the request and the response as normal, then define the logic like this. Oh, my bad. Define it like that. Getting a header out of a request is different than getting a parameter, for example, with this query.code. So if we want to get a certain header, we are going to get it by saying request.get, and the name of the header, so authorization, for example. So let's define our call to the GitHub API to grab the user data, which we're going to define by saying await fetch, then https://api.github.com, and make sure you get that API dot. We can say /user. So this is some logic from the GitHub API that allows us to get information from a certain user by passing in their access token. And so we can define more things about this fetch by saying that the method we want to use is of get, and then the headers here are going to be of authorization. And GitHub wants our authorization headers to be in this very specific format where we say rec.get authorization like this. And I think just to make something very clear, this authorization header is being passed in as bearer and then the access token here. And so that's how most authorization headers are expected. If they're of the bearer type, is to be of, say, this bearer first and then the access token afterwards. So we're passing in that same bearer access token at this line right here. So once this fetch is done, we can do the same exact thing where we're going to take the response of this fetch and then return response.json. So translate it to a JSON format we can then work with. Then say .then, grab the data. And again, I will console.log this data here so we can just see it in the console, kind of learn from that. Similarly, we're going to take the response, set the JSON to data like this. So just to explain what this is doing one more time is we can call get user data from our front end. And from that call, we are going to pass in the authorization header, which is going to be of bearer access token. It's going to look like that. We're then going to fetch data from the user API route from GitHub. Once that data has been fetched, we're going to translate it into a JSON type. We will then take that JSON and then return it to the user by saying res.json data. So make sure to go to your terminal and then restart your server, just so it has all that new logic inside of there. So now we can go to our front end and work with this server. So for this video, I'm going to be using local storage to store the access tokens of our user. I know there are security concerns when it comes to local storage, so I'm going to say this. I have a video on my channel talking about HTTP only cookies. It's not an Express video, it's actually an Apollo server video, but if security is a super concern or you feel like you might be exposed to attacks where someone could grab your local storage, you can also send HTTP only cookies from your server, for example. One reason why local storage is nice is because it allows us to persist the login. And so someone can leave our webpage for a while and then they can come back and still be logged in with GitHub. And I've kind of been hesitant to make local storage videos because there are obvious security concerns with it, but I think it's really cool to show in this video that someone can continuously be logged into our website, for example. It doesn't always make the most sense from a security perspective, so I already see the comments coming, but I think it's interesting to show the logic of how we can work with local storage for at least one video. So within our local storage, we are going to have an item that's going to be called access token. And so we are going to define some logic of we want to log in with. So we want to get an access token under one very specific condition when our application loads. And so that's why I'm over explaining this if statement. If we have the code param, which is that we have an actual parameter in our URL that is a code, that means we probably just got redirected from GitHub, right? And importantly, our local storage.get item of access token is equal to null, which means we do not have anything in our access token. We then want to grab the access token from our backend. So that's kind of the logic of this if statement here. So if we have this code param and we also have no access token, let's go and grab the access token using this code from the user. Because we are going to use an await statement to fetch our backend, I'm going to make an asynchronous function defined right here called get access token. And we are going to call the logic of the function, so we might as well do it right now, at the very end. So this allows us to use the await keyword anywhere inside of here. And so we can use await to fetch our backend. So we can say await fetch http / localhost 4000 / for example, get access token, which is the route we just defined. We can go back over to our server.js and see get access token here, make sure we even spelled it right. There we go, looks good. And we can add a parameter to this request by saying $code is equal to, we can add the value of the code param to the end of that. This is how our server.js gets access to the request.query parameters.code. That's how it gets access right there. And then just to make sure, I'm going to define this fetch having the method of get. Even though I think that's the default, it's still nice to 100% make sure. Oh, my bad, you don't want to close the fetch right here. You want to grab that and then put it over here. We can then go .then. So when this fetch is done, we want to take the response of the fetch and we want to return response.json. We can then take that JSON object that was created and we can work with it over here. We can even go to our backend right now and look at the get access token. What does the data return? Well, if you go to the bottom, it says res.json data. Data is going to be a block of data that's coming from the GitHub API that's going to have an access token property in it. So we can console.log that data. So let's just say we were totally unfamiliar with what it returns. We can always look at our console to see the different data inside of there. But we can see if data.access_token. So just to make sure, in case there's maybe GitHub's having issues that day where they didn't put the access token in our data, for example, we can then save this access token that's provided to us from GitHub to our local storage by saying local storage.setItem. Then it's the name of the item, so access token, and then the value of the item, which is going to be data.access_token. So an important React concept. So if you guys are getting this far, this is a cool little thing to learn about React. Setting our local storage does not force a re-render on React. For example, if you already set a state, that would force a re-render. We might want to show that a user is logged in or not logged in because of this new local storage.setItem, right? So in this example, I'm going to show an easy way to force a re-render in your application. We can go to the top of our application and also import use state from React. We can define our state at the top of our application by saying const re-render, and then set re-render is equal to a use state of false. And so this is kind of a nice way to use state to force a re-render. And so we can take this set re-render and we can just set it to the opposite value of whatever re-render currently is. And so we can actually go and make sure to npm start our application here and check out this login logic. So something important to understand is that when you press login with GitHub, it's then going to cache whatever account you logged in with initially. If you want to get rid of this, for example, and you're testing, you can revoke all user tokens over here if you just want to see the login screen again. But just understand when you log in with GitHub and you're on a regular localhost 3000, it's going to put the code in there, and then it's going to run all of our code like expected. And so this is using fresh data. It's just that GitHub is smart enough to remember your kind of session, who you are. And so that's why that works. And so we now have access to the access token inside of our local storage. And so if you want to go to this menu, you can inspect element, go over to application, and then that's how you see all your local storage as you press over here. And then you can see everything stored in your local storage. So now we have the access token, which is great news. We can now make the functionality for, first of all, changing the UI just a little bit to show that the user is logged in, and also calling the user data. So let's get into that. Just to make things simple, I'm then going to make the function for grabbing user data. Under our use effect, I'm going to say async function get user data. And so we can make this function run on a button click, for example, which is what we're going to do. And we're just going to do a simple await fetch just like before. So it's going to call our backend by saying http localhost 4000 / get user data. I'm then going to define this as a method of get. Then the headers here are going to be of authorization. So there you go. Because remember, if we go to our server.js and we go to the get user data, we're expecting that authorization header, and we're expecting it to be in the format bearer and then access token. So we can even put a little comment here, bearer access token. That's what we're expecting. So we can put in the bearer string like this, and then we can add the access token to the end of it by saying local storage.getItem access token. We can then do another .then statement. As you guys will see, very repetitive here. We take the response, and then we return that response into a response.json, which we can then manipulate with JavaScript. So we can grab that finalized data there. And this is going to give the data of the entire user. For now, I'm just going to console.log the data like this. So we can go and add in some logic to our front-end components here. One of the first things we're going to do is make a little ternary statement where if local storage.getItem of access token, if that exists, we're then going to want to show a certain component, which I'm just going to put a little React fragment here. Then we can use a little colon to say else. If it doesn't exist, we want a different component to show. For example, we want this button to show in the not logged in. So you could imagine this if else as logged in, not logged in, kind of like that. And just to make things obvious, we can even have a little H3 here saying user is not logged in, just so we're super sure about what our application is doing. So from here, though, we can do a little H1 that says we have the access token because we can only get here if that access token exists locally. And we can even create a little logout button. And so you might think like, logging out, that sounds like some crazy thing going on. Well, pretty much we are managing our login, logout state pretty much just by having this access token here. So we can call an onClick function when we click the logout button to pretty much say, all right, define some logic here where we say local storage dot remove item access token. This is pretty much how we log out in our application, is just saying no more access token means no more user means they logged out. It's the simplest way to think about it. Oh, and make sure you spell access token right. And again, we are going to use that set re-render to force re-render our application. And I'm just going to use the opposite value of re-render like this. Again, this is because when we mess with local storage or we change the values around, it does not force a re-render in our application. So we kind of have to do something to force that like this. And so amazing, this button is going to clear our local storage with the access token and then force our React application to re-render, which is great. We can now make a little H3 here, which is going to say get data from the GitHub API. I can even specialize and say get user data. And we can make a little button that is going to allow us to say on click, get user data, which is that function we defined right here. And so this get user data is going to return a huge block of data from our user. And so you can imagine this block of data is going to look something like, name, Cooper codes, date of birth. Okay, I don't know if that's in there, but it's like, someday. Just a bunch of random information related to your user, right? And so if we want to save an object, one thing we can do is create a use state in React to save this huge object. So let's roll up to the top here and create a new state to handle that user data or that user object, which is that large object of data that's relevant to the user that we're getting from the GitHub API. Then you can set the user data as well. It's going to be equal to a use state of an empty object. We can then set that state to this data object. And if it wasn't clear enough, data is going to be equal to something that looks like this. So we can set our user data object to this data that we're receiving from our backend. And this allows us to do something very cool. If we have user data, we want to show it to our frontend. One way of saying if an object has data inside of it is we can use the object in JavaScript by saying object.keys user data. And we want to see if it has keys, so pretty much data inside the object that has a length that isn't equal to 0. And we can even use another ternary statement where we can say, if this is true, show this React fragment. So this is good practice with these. Else, show this React fragment, which I'm just going to make an empty fragment right here. And so then inside of here, we can even do things like say, hey there, user data.login. And so login is how you get like their login name, for example. You can get access to a bunch of different user data, which I'm then going to add more here as we see what information we're getting back from our backend. So let's make sure to save our app.js and go over to the front end. So you guys will see if you're in the same boat as we already have an access token that was stored in local storage from before. So since we already have an access token, we can actually grab user data from the GitHub API right now. For example, I logged in under an account called Cooper Codes Test. And so if you go over to your console, you should see this large block of data. This is everything that the api.github.com/users is returning to us. So we can get the amount of followers, we can get their bio if they have one, their avatar URL. And so you can really make some cool stuff with this. For example, we can grab their avatar URL to show that, and we can also grab their, HTML URL to their profile, for example. So let's go and add that to our front end. So we can add in an image, and I'm going to force the width to be 100 pixels and the height to be 100 pixels because GitHub actually gives you a decently high resolution image. And we can set that source is equal to the user data, so that state of all that user data we just saw on the console, .avatar_URL. And we can also do a link to their profile, for example, which we can say is equal to userdata.html_URL. And this link, I'm going to make sure the style is of color white because links are initially like a weird purple color. I'm just going to define this as a link to the user profile, or let's say GitHub profile. So if we refresh our application, go back to localhost, you'll see we have access to the profile picture, which is pretty cool, and also a link to their profile. So if we can hop over here, and so one cool thing that you guys can see is that I can actually press the back button here and I'm still logged in under the same account. Boom. So I'm still logged in right here and I'm still getting the user data, which is pretty awesome. I can even log out again, for example. And so if you go over to your application here and you see the access token, if you log out, The access token is going to go. You can log in again. It's going to pass in the code, and boom, you're going to get another fresh access token. So this is a great example of the full authentication system working. I know this is a lot of setup, especially just for working with GitHub. If you guys want to see me use other API routes with this access token or kind of discuss the GitHub API in more depth, let me know for sure. But I think this is a great starter project if you just want to initialize GitHub authentication within your applications. Hopefully this video was helpful, and thanks so much for watching.